They say the Tudors killed with steel, but the truth is far quieter and far colder. No scream echoed through the palace halls, yet women vanished as if swallowed by the walls themselves. Whispers rose where evidence never existed, and silence crowned the one who spoke least. Every gesture hid a blade, every gaze rewrote a life, and no one knew who guided the fall. Tonight, you'll walk into that world, where a quiet breath could end a mistress more surely than any sword. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand inside a Tudor corridor at the quietest hour of the day, one would notice how silence could move with more intention than any spoken accusation. It did not rush. It did not strain. And yet it touched every life within those walls. The wives of the Tudor court understood this better than anyone. They did not need to raise their voices or challenge their rivals openly. Their strength lived in restraint, in the stillness that settled behind their folded hands, in the absence of reaction that allowed others to imagine the worst. And imagination, in a place already swollen with ambition and suspicion, was often more fatal than truth. In the early mornings, when the hallways were still cold and servants walked softly, a queen or noble wife could pass through a room without saying a word, yet the air behind her would shift. Ladies in waiting would glance at one another. Maids would lower their eyes, and every person present would begin to interpret her silence according to their own fears. A mistress who happened to be nearby would feel the weight first. It was never a direct target. Tudor wives rarely gave such charity. Instead, a simple lack of recognition became a message sharper than an insult. A woman who was not acknowledged did not exist. And in a court where existence depended on attention, that was the first step toward erasure. The wives understood the court's hunger for stories. Gossip needed only the smallest spark, and silence was the perfect tinder. A mistress who received no reaction from the rightful wife found herself forced into noise. She would try to seem unbothered, then overly composed, and finally desperate to be seen again. That desperation showed in the way she lingered too long in doorways, how she spoke a little louder during meals, or how she dressed with slightly more brilliance than before. These were not crimes. Yet in a world where women were always judged by their restraint, such small shifts appeared like cracks in character. And cracks, once noticed, grew quickly. By midday, the court would already begin weaving its interpretations. A servant who saw the mistress leave a chamber with her jaw clenched would whisper of arrogance. A lady who observed her laugh too brightly would comment on impropriety. No one questioned the wife's silence. It was the mistress's reactions that drew eyes. The court believed that a virtuous woman remained calm. Thus, every sign of discomfort from the mistress, every tightened breath or restless gesture, became further proof of guilt. It did not matter what she actually felt. Perception always outweighed reality. The wives cultivated this dynamic with precision. Their restraint was never passive. When a mistress arrived at a gathering, the wife might turn slightly away, as if adjusting a sleeve. She might excuse herself to speak with someone else. She might allow a soft, unreadable smile to appear for a single heartbeat, long enough to confuse, short enough to torment. These gestures were small, almost invisible, yet they echoed more loudly than confrontation ever could. The mistress, uncertain of the meaning, would try to anticipate what might come next. In doing so, she would begin to make mistakes. Her voice would tremble at the wrong moment. She would plead her innocence when no accusation existed. She would watch the wife too closely, revealing her own insecurity to a court trained to detect weakness. And all the while, the wife remained silent. Servants carried that silence with them like a relic. Their interpretations became whispers passed between doorways. They speculated about impending scandals, imagined secret betrayals, or wondered whether the king had already tired of his latest affection. The more they wondered, the more they spoke, and the more they spoke, the more the silence of the wife seemed meaningful, almost strategic. Before long, rumours formed, vague and unstable, yet strong enough to take root. The mistress became the centre of every murmur, every quiet suspicion. A woman once admired for her beauty or charm now appeared unstable, grasping, and dangerous to the court's delicate harmony. By evening, the wife needed only to sit beside the king with an expression calm enough to suggest nothing, and therefore everything. The court would interpret her composure as certainty, dignity, or even sorrow. They would imagine that she had endured insult with grace. The mistress, meanwhile, would stand alone in a corner of the room, suffocated, not by accusations, but by the absence of them. No one asked her anything. No one offered reassurance. Her isolation became its own verdict. And still, the wife had not spoken. The king, sensitive to the moods of those around him, would notice the shift. He might wonder why his courtiers behaved differently, why attendants grew wary, why the mistress appeared troubled. He would not ask the wife directly. Silence was too delicate to disturb. Instead, he would withdraw slightly from the mistress, creating the first distance. Once that distance existed, others widened it. Every day brought a new small sign. A cooler greeting, a shorter conversation, a missed invitation. Each one felt minor, almost accidental, yet combined. They built a path that led the mistress quietly toward disappearance. By the time the court fully turned, people would say the mistress had changed, though in truth it was the world around her that shifted. They would claim she no longer carried the king's favour, though they had no proof. They would insist something had always been wrong with her, though they only noticed it after being told so by silence. The wife, accomplished in the art of restraint, allowed the court to destroy the mistress on her behalf. This was how Tudor wives survived, by letting the court perform the violence for them. They understood that silence did not simply hide truth, it created new truth. And once created, that truth became impossible to challenge. Much of what had seemed stable within those walls had already begun to fracture under the weight of unspoken meaning. Yet another stillness was waiting, shaped by intentions no one dared acknowledge openly. And somewhere, in that quiet, a single withheld glance would unravel far more than words ever could. Legitimacy in the Tudor court did not announce itself loudly. It did not require displays of devotion or theatrical gestures of loyalty. It existed as a quiet, immovable weight, one that settled first in the crown upon a wife's head, and then in the eyes of everyone who looked at her. A lawful wife did not need to prove anything. Her place had been carved into the structure of the court long before she entered it, and that structure protected her even when affection did not. The king could wander. Rumour could wander even further. Yet her status remained the only certainty in a world built on shifting alliances and sudden ruin. A mistress might glow with temporary favour, but a wife radiated something far more enduring: permanence. The court recognised it instantly. Every bow directed toward her, every formal address, every seat reserved at a long table reminded everyone, including herself, that her role was not dependent on desire. It was written into law, ritual, and expectation. Even when the king grew cold, she remained the axis around which the household turned. That stability, quiet yet unyielding, was its own form of power. This power became most visible in moments when the wife did nothing at all. If a dispute arose between courtiers, the wife merely had to maintain her posture, and the argument quieted. When a mistress entered a room, the wife did not need to look at her. The omission itself carried more weight than reproach. Legitimacy created an invisible pressure, one that forced others to adjust their behavior. Servants stood straighter. Ladies lowered their voices. The mistress, no matter how favored, always hesitated for a heartbeat, aware she was trespassing on sanctioned ground. It is striking how the simplest ceremonies reinforced this hierarchy. At morning mass, the wife approached the altar first. During meals, she was served before any other woman. When letters were read aloud from foreign courts, her name was spoken with titles that no rival could imitate. The repetition of these rituals shaped perception until it became instinct. Even those who privately admired the mistress could not forget that she was temporary, an adornment that might please for a season. The wife, by contrast, existed within the bones of the court itself. This was not a romantic position. Many Tudor wives lived without the comfort of affection. Their marriages, forged between kingdoms or families, were arrangements designed for survival. But survival brought clarity. A mistress pursued the king's heart because she had nothing else. A wife did not need the heart. She held the throne beside him. She occupied the legal seat, the public role, the lineage that mattered. Whether she felt cherished or forgotten, her title protected her with a firmness no emotion could equal. People in the court understood this and adjusted themselves accordingly. Courtiers seeking favor approached the wife before risking conversation with a mistress. Ambitious families sent gifts to her household, not to her husband's latest companion. Even the king's closest advisors deferred to her authority in matters of ceremony, reputation, and dynastic propriety. These gestures formed a network of acknowledgement that wrapped around her like armor. The armor was silent, but it was not gentle. It reminded everyone, including the king, that her removal required justification on a scale no private affection could balance. A mistress might imagine she could rival this power, but the imbalance was obvious to those who watched carefully. When the wife spoke at council dinners, attention sharpened. When the mistress laughed too freely, eyes rolled politely away. The distinction was not about virtue. It was about structure. The wife embodied the rules that held the court together. The mistress merely interrupted them. Order tolerated disruption only briefly, and often with concealed irritation. What made the wife's position even more formidable was how little she needed to defend it. Her legitimacy acted independently of her actions. When gossip emerged, the court instinctively shielded her. If a rumor embarrassed the king, people murmured about his judgments, not hers. If the mistress behaved improperly, the court compared her unfavorably to the wife without hesitation. Even silence worked in her favor. By saying nothing, she allowed others to reinforce her standing again and again. It is unsettling how easily a woman without affection could still command such influence simply by existing within the correct definition. The wives understood this dynamic and used it with precision. They did not need to challenge the king's choices. They needed only to remain visible in the proper way. Present at ceremonies, composed at meals, attentive during public events. These quiet performances reassured the court that order remained intact. In a world terrified of instability, that reassurance mattered more than beauty or charm. The mistress might be adored in private, but the wife held the structure that kept the kingdom from unraveling, and structure always outlasted desire. No one said this aloud, of course, yet the truth seeped into every room, every glance, every measured gesture. The wife's lawful status created a gravitational pull that kept the entire household aligned. Even when she was ignored by the man who had elevated her, she remained untouchable to those beneath him, and the mistress knew it. She felt it in the stiffness of curtsies, in the distance of conversations, in the way doors opened more slowly for her than for the wife. Legitimacy was not warm, but it was absolute. Everything within those walls bent quietly toward the woman who held the rightful title, whether affection touched her or not. Yet deeper tensions waited beneath that calm surface, shaped by the behavior of those who felt their place beginning to narrow. And somewhere in that shifting atmosphere, another gesture of quiet power was preparing to unsettle the balance once more. There were moments in the Tudor court when the slightest movement of a wife's eyes carried more force than any spoken accusation. A single, deliberate glance, cold and measured, could alter the atmosphere of an entire room. It required no explanation. Those who witnessed it understood instinctively that a boundary had been drawn, and the consequences of crossing it would unfold quietly, but unmistakably, in a world where reputation lived or died through perception. Being seen or not seen shaped a woman's fate far more than her behavior ever could. A mistress often felt this shift before she fully understood it. She might enter a hall expecting the usual attention, only to find conversations thinning at her arrival. A few courtiers would lower their gazes. A few more would discreetly step aside, and somewhere in the room, the wife would lift her eyes just enough to acknowledge the intrusion. It was not a glare, nor a confrontation. It was a controlled, expressionless assessment that revealed nothing yet, suggested everything. The mistress, unsettled, would pretend not to notice, but the court had already begun noticing her. The power of that glance rested in its ambiguity. No one could claim the wife had insulted anyone. She had simply looked, but in a court trained to interpret every gesture as political intention, the absence of warmth read like a verdict. It is striking how quickly people responded to that subtle shift. Servants aligned themselves with the wife's stillness, stepping closer to her, offering her more attentive service. Ladies-in-waiting followed her movements with slightly sharper focus, creating an unspoken barrier between her and the woman who threatened her position. Even the king might sense something amiss, though he rarely questioned it aloud. What often followed was even more effective: the wife's refusal to acknowledge the mistress at social gatherings. She did not argue, insult, or display jealousy. She simply did not include her. A feast might be arranged, a small dinner for favoured guests, a musical evening held in a private chamber. Yet the mistress's name would be absent from every list. And because no accusation accompanied this exclusion, there was nothing to defend against. The mistress could complain, but to whom? To object publicly would expose insecurity. To accept quietly meant accepting a descent into irrelevance. Being excluded from the Tudor court was not a minor inconvenience. It was a slow erasure. Influence depended on being present, being watched, and being spoken about. Once the wife denied those opportunities, the mistress began to vanish from the daily rhythm of court life. People who once greeted her with enthusiasm now offered polite, lukewarm nods. Conversations shifted when she approached. Invitations became irregular, then rare. Without visibility, her presence felt increasingly out of place, as though she occupied a space the court no longer recognized. What makes this dynamic even more unsettling is how naturally it unfolded. The wife rarely needed to plan anything. Her composure alone created a standard others felt obliged to follow. In a setting obsessed with hierarchy, ignoring a mistress signaled that she was slipping into a lower rung, one where loyalty, attention, and courtesy no longer flowed toward her. The court always aligned itself with stability, and stability resided with the wife. The mistress, pushed toward the margins, became an afterthought before realizing she had even begun to fade. The most painful part for a mistress was realizing that the wife's power did not rely on emotion. There was no visible anger to confront, no scene to counter, no accusation to refute, only stillness, only absence. The wife could sit in a chamber surrounded by the quiet rustle of gowns and the soft clink of goblets. And by merely lifting her eyes toward an empty doorway, she could remind everyone that the court revolved around her presence. Meanwhile, the mistress found herself wandering through halls where no one looked long enough to fully see her. A mistress who was not seen could not survive. Her influence depended on being visible to courtiers, to servants, to the king. Yet when the wife chose to withdraw recognition, the mistress found herself slowly suffocating under the weight of overlooked moments. It began as discomfort, then embarrassment, then fear. She would try to retrieve her place, speaking more brightly, dressing more extravagantly, moving with forced assurance. But these efforts only exposed her desperation. The court preferred subtlety, and desperation was never subtle. The wife, however, needed only to remain composed. Her gaze carried an authority rooted in legitimacy. And with that authority came the ability to determine who belonged and who did not. A cold glance could imply disapproval. A blank one could imply dismissal. And the briefest flicker of amusement, directed at the mistress, could ignite an entire corridor of whispers by nightfall. It is remarkable how a woman who rarely spoke could command so much influence simply by observing others and allowing herself to be observed while doing so. By the time the mistress realized the full impact of these unspoken judgments, she often found herself standing at the edge of gatherings rather than at the center. She watched conversations she once joined continue without her. She waited for invitations that never arrived. She searched for the king's attention, only to discover that even he sensed the imbalance. And always, at the corner of her vision, the wife remained serene, untouched, and silently victorious. All that unfolded seemed guided by gestures so slight they barely disturbed the air. Yet they reshaped the mistress's world entirely, and as the quiet machinery of perception tightened its grip, another displacement was already beginning to form. Somewhere behind a composed expression, a new withdrawal of recognition waited to darken the halls even further. Power in the Tudor court did not always reveal itself through declarations or commands. More often, it emerged in the quiet spaces between actions, in gestures so controlled they seemed almost accidental. A wife who understood this held an advantage far greater than any formal decree. She could influence the direction of rumor, alter the temperament of an entire room, and destabilize a rival without ever appearing involved. Her silence was not a retreat. It was a deliberate choice that invited the court to fill the void with their own assumptions that reliably served her position. When accusations began to swirl around a mistress, the wife rarely offered denial, but she never offered protection either. Her refusal to intervene created a strange, heavy stillness. People interpreted that stillness in whatever way aligned with their expectations. Some imagined disappointment, others imagined wounded dignity. A few convinced themselves that she knew far more than she said. The truth hardly mattered. The absence of her voice allowed speculation to multiply freely. And speculation in the Tudor court was rarely kind. It is striking how quickly an unspoken narrative could form under these conditions. If a servant made an inappropriate glance or a courtier repeated a careless observation, the wife did not correct them. She simply received the information with the same calm expression she gave to household reports or ceremonial updates. That neutrality unsettled people far more than outrage would have. Outrage could be debated. Silence could not. A mistress might attempt to defend herself, but she ended up speaking into a void that offered no reply, no recognition, no counterpoint. Her words dissipated before they reached any meaningful audience. The wife's restraint created an atmosphere in which others felt compelled to speak. Ladies in waiting, eager to align themselves with perceived virtue, began to recount minor incidents they had previously ignored. Courtiers repeated shadows of stories they could not fully verify. Even outsiders visiting court sensed an undercurrent of judgment, though they struggled to identify its source. The wife never asked for any of this. at least not directly. She simply positioned herself as the figure who absorbed every rumor without visible reaction. Her silence suggested injury, and injury demanded loyal voices to respond on her behalf. What made this form of influence so effective was how little effort it required. The wife did not forbid, threaten, or expose. She merely stepped back at carefully chosen moments. When the court expected her to defend the mistress, she remained composed. When they expected her to protest impropriety, she allowed the matter to drift unanswered. That lack of response unsettled the court more deeply than confrontation. People feared offending her, yet they also feared supporting the mistress without understanding the full situation. Uncertainty bred caution, and caution isolated the mistress almost as thoroughly as scandal would have. In gatherings, the absence of the wife's attention carried a force that bordered on punitive. If she withdrew from a conversation where the mistress stood, the gesture was small but undeniable. If she chose not to enter a room where the mistress waited, courtiers followed her lead. They preferred proximity to legitimacy over proximity to favor. Within hours, the mistress found herself repositioned at the periphery, surrounded by polite avoidance. That subtle shift revealed the fragility of her position. She depended entirely on visibility, while the wife's influence extended even into absence. It is unsettling to consider how invisible this power could look to those outside the court. To an observer unfamiliar with Tudor dynamics, the wife's behavior might seem passive, even mild. Yet within the palace, every quiet withdrawal signaled a calculated escalation. The court read meaning into her stillness, just as they read meaning into the king's gestures or the council's decisions. A woman who removed herself from a gathering did not simply leave. She created a vacuum, and everyone understood that the mistress would be the one pulled into it, struggling to maintain her footing as interpretations hardened around her. Even the king felt the effects of these silent adjustments. A wife who did not argue or accuse forced him to confront discomfort he could not easily explain. She offered no demands, no ultimatums. Instead, she allowed his court to reflect his choices at him through their shifting loyalties. If the atmosphere grew strained, if his advisors acted differently, if his household seemed uneasy, he could not attribute the tension to the wife's anger, because she showed none. Her withdrawal, gentle and understated, created a contrast that made the mistress's presence appear increasingly disruptive. This was the essence of soft power in the Tudor world: influence without declaration, correction without confrontation. A wife did not need to destroy a mistress. She needed only to create the conditions in which the court destroyed her on its own. And once the process began, it unfolded with a momentum that rarely favored mercy. Rumors sharpened, conversations shortened, doors that once opened easily now required explanation. Every absence the wife crafted became a new space for the court to reshape itself according to her advantage. By the time the mistress understood what was happening, she often found herself already isolated. She could no longer trace the beginning of her decline, because no single gesture had announced it. The wife's absence had done the work, an absence that exposed weaknesses the mistress could not hide and magnified doubts she could not overcome. What looked like inaction was in fact a structure of deliberate restraint, designed to shift the balance without appearing to push it. Much of what seemed untouched by conflict had already tilted under the quiet weight of selective presence and subtle retreat. Yet deeper unease waited to surface, shaped by the ways perception twisted when the right woman chose not to speak. And somewhere in the blurred edge of that silence, the next unravelling had already begun to form. A mistress in the Tudor court depended on attention in the same way a flame depends on oxygen. Her influence grew only when people watched her, admired her, or whispered about her presence. Without that gaze, without the court's restless fascination, her role began to collapse in ways she could neither control nor fully understand. The wife knew this better than anyone. She recognized that denying a mistress attention was more effective than confronting her. and far quieter than exposing her faults. Indifference, when applied with precision, hollowed a woman's standing more thoroughly than any scandal. The decline often began with something subtle, the wife's refusal to react. A mistress might wear a gown more elaborate than usual, hoping to draw eyes. But the wife's expression remained unchanged. Courtiers mirrored that restraint, adjusting their tone and posture until admiration felt inappropriate. Without an audience to respond, the mistress's carefully curated elegance seemed excessive, almost desperate. The room absorbed her efforts like a stone floor absorbs the warmth of a single candle. Without acknowledgement, without reflection, without reward, she soon discovered that her role at court had always been performative. Every gesture, every smile, every calculated moment of charm depended on someone validating it. When the wife withheld her reactions, that validation evaporated. The mistress, stripped of the dynamic she relied upon, found herself unsure of how to behave. Should she continue seeking favor? Should she remain quiet? Should she try to regain her earlier brilliance? The uncertainty twisted her confidence into strain. What once appeared graceful now carried the faint tremor of someone trying too hard. It is striking how quickly the court adjusted to this new imbalance. Servants who once scurried to assist the mistress now answered her requests with a measured politeness that bordered on distance. Musicians hesitated before offering her compliments. Even the king's advisors, who previously tolerated her presence with courteous neutrality, began to treat her as a temporary distraction rather than a figure of importance. The shift was not intentionally cruel. It was simply the natural consequence of a hierarchy reorienting itself around the wife's quiet, immutable authority. The mistress felt this change acutely. She noticed when voices softened as she approached, when groups dissolved before she reached them, when courtiers glanced past her rather than at her. These were not dramatic rejections. They were small omissions, tiny cuts that accumulated over days until she sensed herself bleeding influence. She tried to adapt, but without an opponent, without jealousy aimed at her, without resentment to fuel her identity as a rival. She found she had no place to stand. The wife's indifference had removed the tension that once elevated her. Without contrast, she faded into the background. Attention had once been her lifeline. Now, the absence of it pressed on her like a weight. A mistress could not survive in the Tudor court by existing quietly. Quiet was the wife's territory, her shield, her strength. For the mistress, quiet felt like suffocation. She needed to be envied to remain relevant. She needed to be watched to remain powerful. Without someone casting her as a threat, she ceased to be anything at all. The court's memory softened around her until she existed only in fragments, a name mentioned briefly, a rumor brushed aside, a presence tolerated but no longer anticipated. The most unsettling part of this decline was how painless it looked from the outside. No one shouted at her. No one accused her. No one dismissed her publicly. Instead, the court simply forgot to care. People who once monitored her every gesture now turned their attention fully toward the wife. They whispered about etiquette, lineage, and propriety, subjects the mistress could not compete with. Her beauty, once an asset, now seemed ornamental. Her charm, once effective, felt out of place. She had lost the only arena in which she mattered. The wife did not need to celebrate. Her stillness spoke for her. She allowed the court to restore its equilibrium naturally, guided by unwritten expectations that prioritized legitimacy over allure. In that environment, the mistress's attempts to re-establish herself only heightened the contrast. If she tried to stand closer to the king during events, people noticed the impropriety. If she laughed too brightly, they considered it unbecoming. If she remained quiet, they interpreted it as a sign of shame. Every direction she moved led deeper into irrelevance. What makes this form of defeat so devastating is that it leaves no clear point of collapse. There is no decisive moment to mark the downfall. Instead, the mistress dissolves gradually into the fabric of court life until she becomes indistinguishable from those who were never meant to be remembered. People stop asking where she sits at meals, stop wondering where she spends her afternoons, stop mentioning her altogether. And once the court stops speaking a name, that name no longer shapes anything. By the time the king notices her diminishing radiance, the process is already complete. His attention, once a shield, no longer protects her. A mistress who lives by attention dies by neglect, and neglect spreads its influence quietly. One unreturned look, one skipped greeting, one forgotten invitation at a time. Everything that once sustained her had already thinned into air, leaving her stranded between memory and dismissal. Yet further unraveling waited to surface, shaped by the delicate balance between control and collapse. Somewhere within that fading glow, a new stillness was preparing to tighten its hold. Silence in the Tudor court did not merely fill the spaces between conversations, it shaped the meaning of everything that surrounded it. When people stopped speaking, the quiet itself began to function like an accusation, expanding into every corridor and echoing through the smallest exchanges. No defense could be mounted against it because there was nothing tangible to confront. A mistress caught within such silence found herself trapped in a kind of invisible pressure, one that made even her most ordinary movements seem suspicious. The court did not need to declare her guilty. It needed only to stop acknowledging her innocence. Rumours thrived in this atmosphere because silence created the perfect shelter for them. A whispered speculation did not require evidence to spread. It only required that no one contradict it. And contradictions rarely appeared when a wife maintained her calm, deliberate quiet. The court interpreted her refusal to speak as confirmation that something had indeed occurred. In truth, silence told them nothing. Yet they treated it as though it revealed everything. It is unsettling how quickly such logic took hold, spreading through servants' quarters and noble chambers alike until the entire court carried the same unspoken assumption. Those who might have defended the mistress hesitated. They understood that aligning themselves with someone under scrutiny could damage their own standing. Loyalty in the Tudor world was not anchored in affection. It was anchored in survival. A courtier who spoke in the mistress's favour risked appearing naive, reckless, or, worse, complicit in whatever wrongdoing others imagined. So they remained quiet, convincing themselves that their silence was prudence rather than abandonment. Each withheld voice deepened the mistress's isolation, and she felt the shift long before she could articulate it. The absence of support left her exposed. When she approached conversations, people grew politely still. When she laughed, no one joined her. When she attempted to explain some trivial matter, chairs shifted and glances dropped. She realized that even her presence carried discomfort. Those who once welcomed her now avoided the burden of association. It was not open hostility. It was the cold distancing that arises when individuals wish to preserve themselves. The mistress's attempts to find allies only made her appear more frantic, more out of place, more desperate to escape a verdict that had never been spoken aloud. Her voice, once light and confident, developed a tremor she tried to hide. She repeated explanations no one had asked for. She defended herself against accusations that did not exist. In her efforts to appear composed, she revealed the strain that silence had already inflicted upon her. It is remarkable how quickly composure eroded once someone sensed they were being observed from behind a veil of suspicion. The court watched her with a collective, careful distance, as though she carried a stain that might spread if they stood too close. Silence also demanded interpretation, and people supplied it eagerly. A missed greeting became evidence of guilt. A distracted glance became proof of manipulation. A brief absence from a gathering became the seed for darker theories. without words to anchor the truth. Imagination replaced fact. Stories developed layers, then shadows, then edges sharp enough to cut her reputation to pieces. By the time anyone questioned the details, the narrative had already grown too large to challenge. Silence had molded uncertainty into inevitability. Even the king was not immune to the influence of this quiet shift. He noticed the stiffness in his courtiers, the way his wife's calm presence seemed to weigh heavier than usual, the way his mistress's attempts at brightness felt strangely out of place. He found himself wondering whether he had misjudged the situation, though he could not identify what exactly had changed. His uncertainty fed the court's resolve. If the king wavered, others took it as permission to distance themselves further from the woman who now seemed surrounded by a cloud of unspoken doubt. The mistress sensed his hesitation and began to fear it. She tried harder to regain his attention, hoping to counterbalance the silence with affection or charm. But effort, in the Tudor world, was never subtle. People noticed the strain. They interpreted it as deceit. The wife, maintaining her steady calm, allowed these interpretations to bloom naturally, knowing that the court's collective imagination did the work more effectively than any strategic accusation ever could. What makes this particular unraveling so chilling is how little it depended on action. A mistress accustomed to surviving court politics could strategize against direct hostility. She could deny, argue, manipulate, or even perform contrition if necessary. But silence left her with nothing to confront. It consumed every explanation before it reached the air. It blurred the boundaries between truth and assumption. The more she struggled to clarify herself, the more suspicious she appeared. Silence had already predetermined her failure. And then, the collapse arrived quietly. Invitations did not come. Courtiers avoided her path. Servants announced her presence without warmth. She felt the pressure of eyes that pretended not to look. In the Tudor world, forgetting someone was the politest form of execution. She was no longer the vibrant figure who once moved confidently through the king's proximity. She had become a question no one wanted to answer. By the time the court fully withdrew from her, the process felt inevitable. Her voice no longer carried meaning. Her defenses folded into the silence that surrounded her. And though no one said a single condemning word, the verdict was absolute. She had lost, not by scandal, not by confrontation, but by absence. An absence that erased her more thoroughly than punishment ever could. Much of what appeared peaceful had already begun to rot beneath the pressure of unspoken judgment. Yet deeper distortions waited to rise, shaped by the delicate tension between appearance and collapse. Within that quiet suffocation, a new shift in allegiance was already forming its shadow. Life in the Tudor court resembled a performance staged without scripts. Yet everyone acted as if they knew their lines. People watched one another with an attention so sharp it bordered on hunger, searching for cues that might reveal shifting alliances or hidden intentions. In this setting, the wife did not need to write the story that unfolded around her. She only needed to shape the space in which others moved, guiding perception through the way she held her posture. The distance she maintained, the gaze she allowed or withheld. These elements formed an unspoken choreography, one in which even a mistress became a character molded by the expectations of those who observed her. When the wife stepped into a chamber, conversations did not stop, but they changed. Voices softened, stances adjusted, and the weight of the room shifted subtly toward her. She did nothing dramatic. She did not seek the king's attention or confront the mistress with visible disdain. Instead, she aligned herself within the space in a way that suggested authority without force. A single measured glance could change the tone of a gathering more effectively than an accusation. If she looked past the mistress instead of at her, the court noticed. If she positioned herself beside respected nobles while leaving a conspicuous gap near the mistress, that absence carried meaning of its own. Rumors were born from these small adjustments. They drifted first through the stone corridors, carried by servants who sensed tension long before they understood it. Their interpretations, shaped by familiarity with the household's rhythms, slipped into the hands of those who polished floors, lit candles, and served wine, in a court where servants observed more than nobles ever realized. Whispers traveled quickly and quietly. As the stories spread, they stretched, bending toward whatever narrative the court already expected. At feasts, the murmurs multiplied. A courtier leaning slightly toward a friend could spark an entire chain of speculation. If the wife's expression remained serene while the mistress appeared uneasy, people inferred conflict. If the wife laughed softly at a comment the mistress did not hear, some interpreted it as amusement at her expense. Every gesture became potential evidence. Even when no intent existed, the court excelled at creating stories out of silence, layering meaning onto interactions too subtle to survive outside that charged environment. The wife understood this dynamic and used it with restraint. She did not need to slander the mistress. The court would do that on its own, provided she gave them the right environment. A small pause before acknowledging the mistress, to a fractional delay before returning her greeting, a carefully maintained distance during events. These served as signals that something was amiss. They invited speculation without committing to any interpretation. People filled the gaps with their own assumptions, often shaped by their desire to align with stability, propriety, and legitimacy. As rumors traveled farther, they grew sharper. Someone might mention a strange tension at a recent gathering. Another would recall a minor slight from weeks earlier. Soon, a narrative took shape, one in which the mistress was no longer merely a woman favored by the king, but a figure stepping out of her place. The wife, calm and composed, became the silent contrast that made such a narrative believable. The more the gossip grew, the more isolated the mistress became. People hesitated to sit beside her, fearing association with whatever intangible offense the court believed she had committed. The isolation was gradual but unmistakable. Invitations that once arrived promptly now came late or not at all. Conversations once filled with warmth cooled into formality. The hallways that once felt welcoming became narrow, heavy with observation. The mistress began to sense that she had become a character in a play she did not rehearse for, her every gesture interpreted according to a script she had not written. Yet she could not escape the roles others assigned to her. She found herself reacting to rumors she could not trace, to suspicion she could not dispel, to a sense of diminishing space she could not slow. The more deeply the court believed its own whispers, the more powerless the mistress became. People saw only what they expected to see. Nervousness where there was none, impropriety where simple missteps occurred, and arrogance where insecurity trembled beneath the surface. A woman living under such scrutiny did not need to commit a fault. The unfolding narrative consumed her regardless. Meanwhile, the wife maintained her poised stillness, watching the performance unfold without lifting a hand. Her power did not lie in crafting the rumors, but in shaping the environment where they flourished. And flourishing they did, moving like invisible threads through rooms where laughter sounded hollow, and smiles carried warnings. Much of what passed for observation had already become interpretation, reshaping the court's understanding with quiet insistence. Yet deeper consequences were gathering, stirred by the weight of belief more than by any tangible act. As the circle of stories tightened, the next unraveling waited to reveal itself in silence. In the Tudor court, the most effective words were often spoken by those who appeared to have no stake in the matter. A wife who understood this rarely needed to voice her concerns or articulate displeasure. Instead, she allowed others, maids, attendants, supervisors, and minor officials, to shape the air around her with comments that seemed casual, almost accidental. These remarks drifted through the court with an ease that formal accusations could never achieve. They were lighter, sans faire, stripped of responsibility yet heavy with implication. And once released, they travelled far beyond the reach of their original speakers. The maids, who moved between chambers with the quiet familiarity of those who saw much and spoke little, were usually the first to breathe life into these rumours. They did not openly slander the mistress. They simply observed her appearance, with a slight tilt of the head, or exchanged small comments about her complexion, her manners, her attempts at elegance. A whisper about artificial beauty carried more weight in a world that valued restraint. A murmur about poor conduct spread quickly in a court obsessed with decorum. The maid's words were not framed as warnings or criticisms. They were framed as impressions. Subtle, unthreatening, yet sharp enough to cut through the mistress's fragile standing. Above them, the women charged with overseeing the Queen's household played their roles with even greater finesse. These supervisors understood how to craft a narrative without appearing involved. When speaking of the mistress, they might recall an incident from years earlier. The kind of mistake small enough to be forgettable, yet large enough to resurface when her reputation weakened. They presented these recollections as unfortunate memories rather than deliberate judgments. But in a court that listened closely to everything connected to the wife, these forgotten details hardened into something resembling truth. It is unsettling how easily such comments could merge into a broader consensus. Once a few voices hinted at impropriety, others felt emboldened to add their own observations. The mistress's beauty, once celebrated, now became suspicious. Her confidence became arrogance. Her attempts at charm seemed calculated. What had once drawn admiration now inspired doubt. The wife never needed to correct or encourage this shift. She simply allowed the flow of whispers to continue, letting the court decide what to believe. And because the court always leaned toward caution, it believed the rumours long before it questioned their origins. The mistress, unaware of the depth of this transformation, struggled against a force she could not see. She sensed that people regarded her differently. She noticed the maid's wary glances and the cool politeness in the supervisory lady's tones. She recognized that even those who served her seemed reluctant to linger in her presence. Yet she could not trace the cause. No one had confronted her. No one accused her directly. Everyone remained courteous, which only intensified her confusion. The danger in the Tudor court did not come from open hostility. It came from the warm, empty distance that signaled a shift too subtle to challenge. As these whispered impressions grew, the court's perception of the mistress changed with them. She became a figure surrounded not by admiration, but by uncertainty. Her presence raised questions people preferred not to voice. They watched her closely, not out of fascination, but out of suspicion. Her actions, even when harmless, seemed tinged with something hidden. The narrative that formed around her was no longer about beauty or favour. It was about risk. And risk, in a court that valued stability above affection, was intolerable. The most striking part of this process was how little the wife appeared to contribute. She did not criticize the mistress. She did not challenge her presence. Instead, she maintained a calm, dignified silence that compelled others to speak for her. Servants interpreted that silence as disappointment. Supervisors interpreted it as concern. Courtiers interpreted it as wounded dignity. Each group carried forward its own version of the story, unaware that its words collectively shaped the mistress's downfall. As the rumours travelled, they lost their origins but gained authority. People forgot who first mentioned the mistress's supposed flaws. They only remembered that someone had said something, and that someone else had agreed. The wife's innocence in the matter remained intact because she had never voiced an accusation. Her silence wrapped her in plausible distance. Yet everyone understood that the gossip aligned neatly with her interest, and the court adjusted accordingly. The mistress, meanwhile, found herself slipping into a kind of social quicksand. The more she attempted to correct the narrative, the deeper she sank. If she grew defensive, Her defensiveness became another flaw to discuss. If she remained quiet, people interpreted her silence as guilt. No response could reverse the tide once it began to rise. Zulot. Public sentiment expressed through whispers rather than proclamations became the force that crushed her. Jealousy did not defeat her. Malice did not defeat her. The crushing weight of quiet, collective opinion did. And through it all, the wife remained serene, untouched, and entirely unconnected, at least in appearance, to the storm she allowed to gather. Much of what seemed harmless in conversation had already turned into a current strong enough to pull her downward. Yet further distortions were waiting to spread, shaped by the court's eagerness to align with the strongest center of gravity. Where the whispers deepened, a new pressure was already preparing to close in around her. Falling from favor in the Tudor court rarely announced itself with drama. There were no formal declarations, no written records, no public rebukes delivered before watching eyes. Instead, the decline settled slowly, like dust gathering in corners. Quiet, unremarkable, yet impossible to reverse once it took hold. A mistress who lost the king's attention did not face punishment. She faced absence. And in a world sustained by proximity, absence functioned as a sentence far more final than any explicit charge. The first sign often appeared in the simplest forms. People stopped saying her name. At meals, the servants no longer placed her beside influential courtiers. Her presence in conversations shrank until she was mentioned only indirectly, if at all. Her absence from gatherings passed without comment. The court did not intend cruelty. It had merely shifted its attention back toward stability, toward the wife, who required no persuasion to remain central. Favor was bright, but unstable. Once the light moved on, shadows filled the space immediately. The mistress felt the shift before she understood it. She might approach a room expecting the usual warmth, but instead receive polite, fragile smiles that broke the moment she turned away. Courtiers, who once sought her approval, now offered shallow greetings, careful not to linger. The invitations she had taken for granted arrived late, or arrived not at all. These omissions seemed small at first, but they accumulated into a pattern she could not ignore. People were not rejecting her. They were removing themselves from the risk of association. Nothing in her behavior had changed. What had changed was the court's calculation. Aligning with a woman losing favor brought no reward. Aligning with the wife, whose legitimacy remained unshaken, always promised security. So the court adjusted. Quietly, instinctively, efficiently. The mistress's decline required no justification. It simply required that the court stop protecting her. It is striking how complete a disappearance could become without a single word spoken. When people stopped asking after her, they also stopped remembering her. Rooms where she once shone with color now felt indifferent to her presence. She could stand among musicians or courtiers and feel the faint chill of detachment radiating from every direction. No one intended harm. Yet harm accumulated in the spaces where curiosity once lived. Her beauty, once an asset, no longer altered the room's temperature. Her charm, once eagerly received, now passed over unregistered. In the Tudor world, favor was not secured by affection, but by relevance. And relevance required attention. When the king's interest drifted even slightly, the court's interest collapsed. A mistress might attempt to regain her footing, arriving earlier to events, dressing more carefully, speaking with measured brightness. But these efforts rang hollow against a backdrop of growing indifference. People sensed her urgency and avoided it, fearing it signaled instability. Nothing frightened the court more than instability. The wife, observing the quiet unraveling, did not need to intervene. She did not need to speak against the mistress or enforce her diminished standing. She simply allowed the gossip she had never voiced to continue its work. Rumors created the initial punctures, neglect widened them. By staying composed, she ensured the court interpreted the shifting dynamics as natural rather than orchestrated. Her restraint disguised the deliberate patience with which she let the mistress's world soften into nothing. The mistress's greatest fear emerged when she realized she no longer provoked emotion. Not admiration, not jealousy, not even resentment. She existed without friction, without tension, without purpose. In a court that thrived on stories, a woman without a role ceased to matter. People forgot to include her in decisions, in rumors, in recollections of the previous day's events. The erasure was almost gentle. That gentleness made it far more devastating. There came a point when even the king's attention toward her felt symbolic, a politeness rather than a desire. He did not dismiss her outright, but he no longer sought her out. Their conversations were shortened. His gaze slipped past her toward matters easier to manage. In a household defined by hierarchy, even the smallest waning of royal interest was enough to confirm the narrative already circulating. The mistress had slipped from the center, and nothing she did could reverse the direction of the fall. Her disappearance from court life did not require exile. It required only continued silence. She drifted outward, first from gatherings, then from private audiences, then from the daily consciousness of those who once watched her with fascination. Eventually, her absence became normal. People assumed she preferred quiet spaces or was recovering from some private sorrow. No one asked questions. Questions would require acknowledging her again. And the wife, seated firmly in the place that had always belonged to her, simply remained. Time worked in her favor. Rumor supplied the momentum. The court supplied the structure. The mistress, left without allies or purpose, supplied the rest of her own undoing by existing in a void she could neither fill nor escape. Much of what once defined her presence had already slipped beyond reach, dissolving into the faint hum of shifting loyalties. Yet deeper withdrawal waited to surface, shaped by the court's readiness to forget what no longer served its balance. In the narrowing quiet around her, another force was already beginning to tighten the boundaries of her world. The wife's power often revealed itself not through confrontation, but through a quiet withdrawal that unsettled the court far more effectively than any display of anger. She did not challenge the king's choices or force him to defend his preferences. Instead, she stepped back with a measured calm that created a void around her. A void the court quickly interpreted as a symptom of deeper instability, in a world where equilibrium mattered more than affection. Her silence functioned as a signal sharper than accusation, shaping perceptions without ever naming a grievance. Her refusal to demand a decision unnerved those who observed her. A wife who did not protest suggested a woman who had already begun to detach. And detachment in the royal household threatened more than marital harmony. It threatened the structure the court depended upon. When she excused herself early from meals or withdrew from gatherings with a soft, unreadable expression, the king did not face a plea for loyalty. He faced the discomfort of uncertainty. The mistress's presence stirred complication. The wife's distance exposed it. She did not insist on being chosen. She simply allowed the complications to accumulate around the king until they became impossible to ignore. Courtiers watched the tension gather and interpreted her absence as a sign of strain she would not articulate. That restraint compelled them to question whether the king's indulgence had endangered the stability they relied on. They began to adjust their behavior, aligning themselves more visibly with her composure and creating an unspoken contrast between her steadiness and the confusion introduced by the mistress. The wife never requested separation or threatened departure. She did not allude to personal injury or moral outrage. Her silence framed the mistress as the source of discord, even when she never suggested such a thing. By refusing to demand resolution, she let the court draw its own conclusions, that the royal household was losing its balance, that the mistress's presence clouded decisions. That discomfort would only deepen if the matter remained unresolved. Her restraint made the burden appear self-evident. The king, accustomed to managing visible conflict, found himself troubled by problems that took no explicit form. A complaint could be negotiated, soothed, or dismissed. Silence offered no foothold. When he saw the wife sitting with composed stillness, surrounded by courtiers who showed her deferential warmth, he sensed the dissonance without understanding its shape. Her lack of accusation made him question his own judgment. If she had protested, he could have defended himself, but she simply moved through her days with a calm that made her seem unreachably dignified, and that dignity made room for doubt. The court supported her without ever needing to articulate its loyalty. They gravitated toward her presence, inviting her into conversations, maintaining a respectful distance that suggested she embodied the order they depended on. None of this required coordination. It emerged naturally, shaped by instinct and caution. When the mistress entered the same room, the contrast felt uncomfortably clear. Her brightness seemed misaligned with the gravity of the moment, and the king felt the shift as sharply as everyone else. He did not want chaos. He wanted predictability. The wife offered that simply by existing. The mistress, watching this shift unfold around her, sensed the imbalance growing stronger but did not know how to correct it. She tried to remain composed, to smile, to appear unfazed. Yet her efforts only emphasized her precarious position. She reacted while her wife did not. She tried to regain her footing while the wife simply stood still. The more she sought attention, the more the court interpreted her behavior as a sign of instability. The wife's refusal to acknowledge the struggle made the mistress's attempts appear frantic, even when they were measured. In a society where silence carried meaning equal to spoken words, the wife's restraint became the most powerful instrument available to her. She showed neither approval nor refusal. She neither defended nor accused. She left the tension unresolved, knowing the court would resolve it for her. Her quiet presence allowed others to identify the trouble without her pointing to it. No one needed to be told that the king could not maintain both peace and disruption. The conclusion felt inevitable. Eventually, the king faced a truth he had tried to overlook. Beauty did not stabilize his household. Charm did not quiet his counsel. Favor did not settle the unrest pressing against the edges of court life. Order mattered more than admiration, and dignity mattered more than delight. In the wife's silence, he recognized the weight of responsibility. In the mistress's growing discomfort, he recognized the cost of ignoring it. He acted not because his wife pressured him, but because her absence forced him to notice the imbalance she no longer tried to counter. The court breathed easier when he did. Stability restored itself without fanfare, and the wife stepped back into place without saying a single word. Much of what guided his decision had already gathered in the spaces she left untouched, shaping understanding with quiet gravity. Yet a deeper shift waited to surface, drawn from the court's instinct to cling to whatever preserved its fragile equilibrium. Along the fading warmth of that uneasy calm, another fracture was preparing to reveal where loyalty would bend next. Waiting in the Tudor court carried a weight that few understood until they were forced to feel it. The wife did not pace her chambers or watch the doors with restless anxiety. She did not cling to the king's attention or compete for it with visible effort. Instead, she embraced a stillness that unsettled the court far more than any display of jealousy. Waiting for her was not passive. It was deliberate, sharpened into a quiet strategy shaped by patience and precision. She knew that time inside the palace walls did not flow gently. It carved, eroded, exposed, and she trusted that the mistress, favored today, would eventually falter beneath the pressure that favor demanded. The first part of her waiting involved the king himself. She understood his patterns better than he realized. The court watched his preferences shift like candlelight in a draught, warm one moment, flickering the next. A mistress dazzled him with novelty, but novelty always thinned with repetition. The wife placed no obstacles between them. She did not warn, accuse, or intervene. She simply allowed the king's fascination to run its course, knowing it rarely endured without effort, and knowing the mistress could not sustain the brilliance expected of her. The wife's patience, in contrast, required no performance. It was a presence shaped by permanence, and permanence had a gravity the king always returned to. Her waiting also extended toward the mistress. A woman elevated by desire rather than legitimacy carried a fragile stability. The wife understood that the mistress would eventually reveal a misstep, not because she sought it, but because the palace demanded relentless perfection from those without protection. A careless comment, a moment of irritation, a gesture misinterpreted by watchful eyes. Small fractures that grew into weaknesses when magnified by the court. The wife did not push her toward failure. She simply left space for failure to arrive on its own. Time, in that environment, became sharper than intent. Waiting shaped the currents of gossip as well. Rumors lived longer than affections, and the wife knew how they drifted through the corridors. Slow at first, then gathering momentum. Whispered doubts became shared concerns. Shared concerns became accepted truths. The court did not need direction. It needed a quiet center around which interpretation could gather. The wife offered that center by remaining composed, dignified, and consistent. Against her steadiness, the mistress's vulnerabilities grew more noticeable. The wife never needed to speak against her. Gossip did the speaking. Time gave it structure. Silence permitted it. What made this waiting powerful was the way it disguised itself as virtue. The wife appeared gracious, patient, and unbothered. She seemed uninterested in rivalry, refusing even the smallest gesture of confrontation. Her restraint made her appear generous. But generosity was not her goal. Her goal was survival. Longer, deeper, steadier survival. While the mistress lived in the brightness of temporary favor, the wife lived in the shadows of endurance. She understood that jealousy flared and vanished, but waiting carved consequences with far greater precision. The court felt the waiting was more than the wife ever expressed. Courtiers shifted their behavior subtly, lingering longer near her, choosing her side of the room, offering deference that signaled where stability resided. Their reactions fed into the unfolding narrative, reinforcing her quiet strength. The mistress, watching these movements, sensed tension she could not name. She felt the edges of her world tightening, not through hostility, but through an uncomfortable anticipation, an awareness that something was approaching, though no one could say exactly what. In this atmosphere, the wife's patience became a force of its own. She did not hurry the process. She did not manipulate it. She simply let it continue, trusting the palace to amplify every small imbalance. When the mistress faltered, the court would notice. When the king grew weary, the court would adjust. When the rumors deepened, the court would align. Waiting allowed each of these shifts to occur naturally, without the wife appearing responsible for any of them. And when the inevitable moment arrived, when the king's interest dimmed, when the mistress made an unwise remark at an unfortunate time, when the whispers hardened into certainty, the wife did not need to step forward. She only needed to remain exactly where she had always been. In a world of crumbling roles, survival belonged to the one who endured without effort. Much of what shaped her advantage had already taken root in the slow space she allowed to widen between appearances and truth. Yet a deeper unraveling waited to rise, stirred not by conflict, but by the quiet imbalance that patience had created. Amid the thinning edge of disappointment, something colder was preparing to surface. Silence inside the Tudor court rarely meant agreement. More often, it served as a mirror, one that reflected insecurity with painful clarity. The wife understood this instinctively. She did not confront the mistress or attempt to expose her faults. She simply remained still, offering no resistance and no reassurance. The absence of reaction became its own form of pressure, tightening slowly around the mistress until every gesture she made seemed louder than she intended. Within this growing tension, the mistress began to respond not to what the wife did, but to what the wife refused to do. The more the wife held her composure, the more the mistress felt the need to prove herself. She spoke with unnecessary brightness during meals, laughed too quickly at remarks that did not require laughter, and inserted herself into conversations where her presence once felt effortless. Her attempts to reaffirm her place became increasingly transparent, revealing the very insecurity she hoped to hide. Courtiers noticed the shift immediately. In a world where subtlety was currency, desperation read like a warning. Her movements grew sharper as well. A misplaced sigh, a glance toward the king, a slight tremor in her voice. Each sign fed into the court's growing perception that something in her confidence had fractured. The mistress, who once walked with fluid grace, now displayed a tension she could not suppress. She corrected servants too harshly, reacted defensively to harmless comments, and asked questions that revealed her need for assurance. The court was not cruel, but it was observant. Observing her slip became unavoidable. The wife, meanwhile, maintained a posture of quiet detachment. She sat with her fan in hand, opening and closing it with a steady rhythm, her expression smooth and unreadable. She made no effort to engage the mistress, but she did not exclude her either. She merely allowed the space between them to speak. The calm she exuded deepened the contrast between their behaviors. Her stillness made the mistress's agitation appear exaggerated. Even when it was slight, the court interpreted the difference as evidence of stability versus disorder. This imbalance grew sharper during gatherings. When the king entered a room, the mistress brightened noticeably, arranging herself with deliberate charm. If he lingered near someone else, her smile tightened. If he addressed the wife with even a trace of warmth, the mistress's face flickered with unease. These micro-reactions, once invisible, now attract attention. People watched her as they might watch a candle struggling in a draught, uncertain when the flame might distort. The need to be seen, to be validated, became her undoing. She spoke too often, attempting to fill silences that were not meant for her voice. She interrupted conversations unintentionally, eager to correct any impression that might place her at a disadvantage. She laughed at inappropriate moments and offered explanations no one requested. Every attempt to assert control only emphasized how little she possessed. Even the king, perceptive in his own limited way, began to notice the strain beneath her composure. The court interpreted her behavior not as a response to pressure, but as evidence of an inherent flaw. They whispered that she was unstable, too emotional, too demanding of attention. These judgments spread quickly, shaping the narrative in which the mistress became the source of discomfort, while the wife remained the anchor of propriety. The wife did not need to encourage these interpretations. Her silence had already created the environment where they thrived. What made her strategy so devastating was that nothing she did could be blamed. She was polite, reserved, and entirely dignified. She did not challenge the mistress or claim superiority. She simply remained still long enough for the mistress's own reactions to reveal themselves. And because the court expected restraint from those in power, the mistress's growing agitation appeared inappropriate, even dangerous. Silence achieved what accusation never could. It pushed the mistress into exposing vulnerabilities she had tried so carefully to conceal. The mistress soon found herself navigating a contradiction she could not resolve. The more she tried to maintain the king's interest, the more transparent her efforts became. The more transparent they became, the more isolated she felt. And the more isolated she felt, the more intensely she reacted. Each small misstep fed into the court's existing suspicion, amplifying her every gesture into something heavier and more consequential. Meanwhile, the wife continued to sit quietly, her fan resting lightly in her hand, her gaze calm and unthreatening. She offered no confrontation, no commentary, no interference. Her serenity became a quiet screen against which the mistress's unravelling projected itself with stark clarity. The difference between them was no longer a matter of role or status. It had become a matter of control, and control, in the Tudor palace, determined survival. Much of what exposed her weakness had already grown from reflections she could not steady, shaped by the silence she tried to overcome. Yet deeper cracks waited to spread, drawn out by the court's instinct to magnify anything that disturbed its fragile order. Along the narrowing tension, another shift was preparing to knock loose what little ground she still held. Endurance in the Tudor court mattered far more than triumph, and the wives understood this with a clarity the mistresses rarely possessed. Power did not always belong to the one who shone brightest. It belonged to the one who remained after the brightness dimmed. The wife did not measure her position by affection or novelty. She measured it by permanence, by the knowledge that her role, though constrained, was anchored by law, lineage, and time. A mistress might ignite fascination, but fascination was a fragile foundation. The wife relied instead on the slow, persistent weight of her presence, which settled into the palace like stone, quiet, immovable, essential. She did not need to win the king's heart. She only needed not to be replaced. In a world where kings shifted their attention as easily as the court shifted its loyalties, survival depended not on chasing affection, but on withstanding its fluctuations. The wife accepted this without resentment. Acceptance was not surrender. It was a strategy. She knew that passion burned quickly, pulling mistresses upward into a blaze that dazzled the court. Yet every blaze consumed itself eventually. What remained afterward were the stones, the structures too fundamental to be undone by impulse. The mistress, by contrast, lived suspended above uncertainty. Her status rose on the strength of desire, which changed its shape without warning. She could not rely on tradition or law. Her influence existed only in the present moment, vulnerable to every shift in mood, every small irritation, every political gust the king encountered. She climbed quickly, but the higher she ascended, the thinner the air became. The court watched her ascent not with admiration, but with anticipation, knowing that falls were inevitable, and that falls in the palace were rarely gentle. The wife's endurance also shaped the court's rhythm. When uncertainty stretched across the palace, courtiers gravitated toward whatever felt stable, and stability always led them back to her. She did not command them, but her very existence commanded a kind of collective instinct. Aligning with her was aligning with continuity. Aligning with the mistress was aligning with volatility. Over time, volatility exhausted people. They sought the person whose place would remain untouched even when the court trembled. Mistresses often failed to see this larger structure. They believed influence came from presence, from beauty, from the king's favour. And for a time, it did. The court adapted quickly to whoever captured the king's gaze. But adaptation was not loyalty. It was a temporary accommodation, a performance shaped by necessity. Once the king's desire shifted or dulled, the court retreated just as quickly, returning to the gravitational pull of the wife. Longevity, not brilliance, shaped the court's memory. The wife understood this deeply. She did not attempt to extinguish the mistress's spark. She simply waited for it to fade, as sparks always did. Her patience was not passive. It was fortified by centuries of tradition that positioned wives as the backbone of dynastic order. Even in moments of humiliation, even when pushed aside emotionally, she remained central, structurally. The court would not gamble the stability of the kingdom on the unpredictable nature of a mistress, and the wife did not need to remind them of this. They reminded themselves. Over time, this endurance wore down even the king's certainty. He experienced his infatuations intensely, but fleetingly. When the intensity waned, he returned, not because of sentiment, but because of familiarity. The wife represented the world he could rely on: ceremony, family, inheritance, and the carefully maintained image of the royal household. She was not the source of excitement. She was the source of order. That distinction mattered more than affection ever did. The mistress, witnessing this quiet gravity pulling the king back, often mistook it for manipulation. It was not. It was simply longevity. She could not compete with time. She could not compete with the slow accumulation of presence that solidified the wife's position. Even when the mistress tried to mirror the wife's composure, the attempt felt strained. Stability cannot be imitated by those who live in fear of losing what they have. The wife's true advantage lay in understanding that power in the Tudor palace was never absolute. It was atmospheric. It shifted, condensed, evaporated, and returned. She did not try to control its movements. She let them pass, knowing they would come back to her as long as she endured. Endurance required neither brilliance nor force. It required the ability to outlast. And outlasting, in a court defined by volatility, became the highest form of victory. Much of what secured her place had already taken shape through the quiet certainty she carried, untouched by the frantic pace around her. Yet deeper consequences waited to rise. Drawn from the court's instinct to cling to whatever could survive its own restlessness, across that slow tightening of loyalty, something colder was preparing to close around the woman who could not hold her ground. The most disarming words inside the Tudor court were never the loud ones. They were the soft, wandering phrases spoken as if by accident, phrases that slipped into conversations without intention, or at least without the appearance of it. The wife mastered this art with a precision so subtle that most listeners did not realize they had been guided toward suspicion until the thought settled firmly in their minds. She never criticized the mistress. She never accused, never hinted at wrongdoing. Instead, she released delicate observations into the air, light as dust, yet capable of reshaping the entire atmosphere around her. At a gathering, she might glance briefly toward the mistress before turning to a nearby courtier and murmuring, almost absently, "She doesn't seem well these days." The tone carried no hostility, no sarcasm, no urgency. It sounded like concern, even empathy. But concern became curiosity, and curiosity became doubt. A single remark, soft, offhand, compassionate, invited the court to scrutinize the mistress more closely. They watched her posture, her complexion, the steadiness of her voice. Every minor flaw, once overlooked, now seemed meaningful. The wife did not follow these remarks with explanations. She allowed silence to fill the space around them, giving listeners room to interpret her words however they pleased. And they did interpret them. Some imagined illness. Others imagined emotional strain. A few whispered about instability. None of these conclusions came from the wife. They emerged from the fertile ground of uncertainty she had quietly prepared. Another time, she might speak in the gentle tone of someone commenting on the weather. "The king seems forgetful lately." The statement itself was harmless. Yet in a court where memory guided alliances, forgetfulness suggested distraction, irritation, or dissatisfaction. The listeners, eager to remain aligned with stability, immediately searched for explanations. They noticed when the king's gaze passed over the mistress without interest. They noticed when he responded slowly to her words. They noticed when he chose to sit near his wife instead. The wife never pushed these interpretations forward. She merely allowed them to exist. Her words did not direct suspicion. They created openings where suspicion could grow naturally. The court filled those openings with its own anxieties. People who lived in constant fear of misalignment, listened closely to every nuance, desperate to remain on the correct side of shifting power. A remark that seemed casual became a signpost. They followed it without being asked. The mistress, unaware of these small seeds being planted in conversations far from her presence, felt the change only in the way people began to look at her. Their eyes lingered longer, studying her expression for signs of distress she did not feel. Their smiles tightened at the edges. They asked polite but pointed questions. "Are you sleeping well? Is everything quite all right today?" The abundance of concern felt suffocating. She sensed something moving beneath the surface, but no one would say what it was. Doubt, once awakened, hid behind curtains and eyes and smiles. Impossible to confront. The wife made no effort to direct these exchanges. She allowed courtiers, attendants, and officials to repeat her words in their own voices, each repetition gaining a slight edge. By the time her remarks reached the far edges of the palace, they had transformed into warnings, then into criticisms, then into quiet condemnations. People discussed the mistress not with malice, but with concern. Concern shaped by the wife's gentle observations. Their intentions felt benevolent, even protective. But benevolence in the Tudor court often became the mask for far more dangerous forces. What made the wife's strategy so effective was that she never attached judgment to her comments. She sounded thoughtful, patient, resigned. Her restraint made her appear reliable. Her calm made her appear truthful. And in contrast, the mistress, already strained by isolation and pressure, appeared unstable, regardless of her actual behavior. The court trusted the wife, not because she demanded trust, but because she wrapped her words in a softness that felt impossible to question. The king, hearing whispers he could not trace, grew uneasy. He noticed the mistress's attempts to maintain composure and interpreted them as signs of fragility. He noticed the wife's quiet endurance and interpreted it as strength. None of this was spoken. All of it was felt. He began to question whether the balance of his household had been disturbed, and whether the disturbance came from the woman who shone too brightly, rather than the woman who remained steady. Through it all, the wife remained untouched by accusation. She had said nothing harmful. She had only observed. Her comments did not attack. They drifted. They echoed. They expanded. Suspicion did not cling to her, because she had never claimed authority over the conclusions others reached. She had simply allowed those conclusions to form. Her greatest weapon was not the content of her words, but their incompleteness. Half-statements, soft thoughts, small questions left unanswered. Those fragments grew in the minds of others, filling themselves in with whatever the palace most feared. Much of what unsettled the court had already emerged from the spaces her unfinished words left behind, tightening quietly around, shifting assumptions. Yet deeper distortions waited to take form, stirred by the court's eagerness to believe what it could not clearly name. Across that widening haze of implication, another quiet unravelling was preparing to deepen the divide. In the Tudor court, gestures carried weight that words could never hold. A single movement, small, controlled, almost invisible, could bend an entire room into silence. The wife understood this truth intimately. She did not need to raise her voice or offer accusations. She could tilt the balance of perception with nothing more than the soft closing of her eyes. A gesture so restrained that most would not even call it deliberate. Yet in a world trained to read meaning in every breath, her stillness became a verdict. When she lowered her gaze, even for a heartbeat, conversation stopped with a suddenness that trembled through the room. Courtiers pretended to continue speaking, but their sentences faltered, thinned, and dissolved. They waited, unsure whether they had just witnessed fatigue, disappointment, or something far more serious. The ambiguity mattered more than any definitive meaning. Ambiguity created space for interpretation. and interpretation in the palace spread faster than the truth. Her quiet pause, barely noticeable, carried the power of an unspoken accusation. In that silence, people began crafting narratives to fill the void. Had the mistress offended her? Had the king acted thoughtlessly? Had the household slipped into disorder without anyone noticing? The wife did not answer these imagined questions. She merely opened her eyes again with the same calm, revealing nothing. Yet the tension she left behind remained tangled in every observer's thoughts. No gesture of the mistress could undo it. No declaration of innocence could soften it. The wife's stillness had already shaped the room's perception before the mistress had a chance to defend herself. Her absence commanded even more influence. When she quietly chose not to attend a feast, the court reacted as though a tragedy had occurred. People whispered in the hallways, voices lowered to respectful murmurs. They speculated about her health, her mood, her thoughts, and the kingdom's stability. A missing seat at the king's side felt heavier than an empty throne. Even those who pretended indifference felt the shift. If the mistress arrived that evening in full splendor, her radiance appeared misplaced, almost inappropriate. The feast became an uncomfortable stage, illuminated but hollow. Her presence could not compensate for what the wife's absence implied. In the palace, absence was never interpreted as negligence. Absence was interpreted as intention, and intention, when unspoken, allowed every possible meaning to gather in the minds of those who watched. The wife understood how deeply people feared disorder. Her refusal to appear did not accuse the mistress directly, yet it suggested that something essential had cracked beneath the surface. The court, unwilling to believe the crack belonged to the wife, turned its suspicions toward the mistress with predictable consistency. The mistress felt the shift immediately. When she entered a room without the wife present, the atmosphere pressed against her like a closing fist. People greeted her politely, but their eyes flickered with questions she could not answer. She became hyper-aware of her posture, her breath, her speech. Every movement felt magnified, as if she were walking under a lens designed to reveal fragility. The king, sensing the tension but not understanding its cause, offered reassurance that sounded thin even to himself. What made the wife's absence so powerful was that she never explained it. She did not claim illness or distress. She did not ask to be excused. She simply allowed her seat to remain empty. The court filled that emptiness with meaning that deepened over time, solidifying into an impression that the household had tilted out of alignment. People assumed she knew something they did not. They assumed she felt something she would not say. And in their attempts to interpret her silence, they created the very instability she appeared to mourn. Her presence, when she eventually returned, only intensified the effect. She entered quietly, with the same poise she had always carried, and the room straightened around her. Courtiers shifted their weight, smoothed their expressions, and watched her with careful relief. The mistress, seated across the chamber, felt herself shrinking under the unspoken comparison. No elaborate gown or bright smile could compete with the wife's composed gravity. The mistress appeared decorative. The wife appeared necessary. A single nod from the wife, slow, subtle, restrained, could end an entire conversation or steer its direction without effort. People interpreted her small gestures with astonishing sensitivity. A lowered eyelid suggested disapproval. A slight tilt of her chin signaled acceptance. A quiet exhale hinted at disappointment. No gesture was wasted. Every gesture was observed. Her control over perception was so complete that she never needed to deny or confirm anything. The court confirmed it for her, shaping reality according to the space she occupied. Vắng mặt. Đối với người khác, chỉ là một khoảng trống. Với bà, it became present in a different form. A presence that stretched beyond walls and into the minds of everyone watching her. She did not need to speak to shape outcomes. She only needed to exist, either visibly or invisibly, in ways that reminded the court where stability lived. Much of what tightened around her rival had already grown from gestures too small to trace. Weighted with meanings no one dared to question. Yet deeper fractures waited to push forward, stirred by the court's instinct to cling to the steadiness she embodied. Through the fragile quiet gathering around her return, another shift was preparing to press the mistress further toward the edge. Jealousy, as understood by the court, belonged to those without steadiness. It belonged to the insecure, the impulsive, the ones who feared loss more than they understood their own position. The wife did not fall into that category. She did not weep in hidden chambers or lash out at servants or demand reassurances from the king. Her silence did not tremble. It settled. She viewed the unfolding situation not as a wound, but as a board, one where pieces would shift with or without her interference, and where she, if patient enough, could steer the arrangement with almost imperceptible movements. Her restraint was not weakness. It was her advantage. There were no broken mirrors in her rooms, no dramatic symbols of despair. Instead, she replaced the hands that held the mirrors. When a maid who once admired the mistress began lingering near the wife, it was not through coercion but through gravity. People moved toward the wife because she did not ask them to. She allowed their doubts to ripen naturally. Her calmness made the mistress's volatility stand out more sharply. Those who once praised the mistress's beauty began to wonder if that beauty obscured something less stable. By shifting nothing except the direction of attention, the wife altered the court's loyalty. She understood that breaking objects or raising her voice would only diminish her position. Outbursts belonged to women who lacked security. The wife carried security not as comfort, but as a weapon. The court read her composure as authority. They watched her move through rooms with a slow, measured grace and recognized that such control could not be overridden by charm or novelty. Even the king felt this contrast. The mistress's brightness flickered when tested. The wife's steadiness did not. Thus, she did not argue when the mistress entered a room. She did not glance sharply across tables or murmur criticisms behind fans. She simply allowed the mistress to act freely, knowing each movement would reveal its own edges. The mistress might laugh too loudly, interrupt at the wrong moment, or seek reassurance from the king's gaze. These missteps were small but sharp in a court obsessed with restraint. The wife did not need to magnify them. She only needed to remain still while the court noticed. Her silence created a frame around every action the mistress took. A gesture that once appeared charming now felt excessive. A remark that once sounded clever now sounded strained. The court, sensing the contrast, drifted away from the mistress. Not abruptly, but gradually, like water receding from a shore. The wife's presence pulled them back, not with force, but with familiarity. She represented the world they trusted, ceremonial, orderly, predictable. The mistress represented disruption, and disruption grew tiresome. In moments when the mistress grew anxious, her attempts to regain footing often betrayed her. She spoke more, tried harder, reached further into conversations where she once carried ease. Each attempt strained against the silence surrounding the wife. Jealous women fought for attention. The wife denied the court even a glimpse of agitation. Her refusal to react made the mistress's every movement look louder, every effort more desperate. The contrast hardened into perception, and perception in the palace quickly solidified into truth. It was not the wife who pushed the mistress toward departure. It was the mistress herself, slowly unraveling beneath the weight of expectations she could not meet. The wife simply allowed the unraveling to occur. Courtiers whispered that the mistress seemed restless. They noted how her expressions tightened, how her smiles thinned, how her laughter no longer carried warmth. These were observations born from watching a woman trying too hard. And trying too hard, in the Tudor court was unforgivable. The king, sensitive to shifts he rarely understood fully, began to feel uneasy in the mistress's presence. Her attempts to reassure him revealed how much assurance she needed. Her body leaned toward him, signaling dependence rather than allure. Her voice sought confirmation instead of offering levity. He felt the tension before he could articulate it. When he turned toward his wife, he found no such urgency. Her calmness steadied him, reminding him of the structure he relied upon. This was the quiet truth the wife embodied. Jealousy destroyed those who yielded to it, but patience destroyed those who provoked it. She did not need to show emotion. She only needed to show control. And in the palace, control redefined everything it touched. Much of what shaped her dominance had already emerged from the calm she refused to abandon, deepening the contrast with the unraveling beside her. Yet deeper consequences waited to sharpen, stirred by the court's instinct to cling to whatever steadiness remained. Within that growing divide, another shift was preparing to tighten the pressure on the woman who could not endure it. Gentleness in the Tudor court was never as simple as it appeared. The wife who carried herself with restraint and softness did not stand alone. Around her moved a quiet network of maids and attendants who understood her without instruction. Women who absorbed the atmosphere of each room and responded to it with a precision that required no spoken command. The wife never needed to sharpen her voice or lift her hand. Her presence shaped the behavior of those around her, and those around her shaped the court. A single glance from her could stir movement in places she never touched. If her eyes lingered a moment too long on a doorway, a maid would drift toward it, whispering to another before disappearing down a corridor. If she paused in thought, heads bowed instinctively, as though acknowledging that something delicate had shifted. Her attendants did not exaggerate or invent drama, but they understood the language of the palace, its hunger for stories, its sensitivity to implication, and they carried that language with them wherever they went. One glance from the wife, soft and controlled, could inspire a maid to share a story that had never happened. These stories did not sound malicious. They sounded worried, hesitant, almost apologetic. A maid might murmur that the mistress had seemed anxious or overheated or overly bold. She could describe a tone that felt slightly off, a gesture that appeared a touch too eager. None of these details held an accusation. They held the possibility, and possibility, when repeated from mouth to mouth, hardened into likelihood. The wife never asked for this. She simply existed in a way that encouraged people to defend her before she needed defending. Her maids watched the court with the alertness of birds perched on branches, silent until a breeze signaled danger. They noted every misstep the mistress made, every small crack in her facade. When the wife lifted her hand, smoothing a fold of fabric or adjusting a fan, they understood the shift instantly. That single movement could travel through the palace like a signal. Servants would straighten. Courtiers would be quiet. The mistress, feeling the room change without understanding why, would falter in the smallest ways. A cracked rhythm in her speech, a strained smile, a hesitation in her posture. These subtle breaks became the threads the maids wove into whispers. A simple gesture, a lowered eyelid, a tilt of the wrist, could determine how the entire palace moved around her. Her attendants, seeing these signals, adjusted their own behavior. They slowed their pace when passing the mistress. They quickened their service around the wife. They exchanged glances thick with unspoken meaning. The court, endlessly attentive, interpreted these shifts as reflections of a hierarchy not formally stated but universally recognized. A wife whose servants gravitated toward her carried authority even when she uttered no command. Through their actions, the maids made choices on behalf of the palace. They chose whom to greet first, whom to avoid, whom to serve promptly, and whom to ignore for a beat too long. These decisions, made dozens of times across the day, shaped the texture of the court more deeply than royal decrees. When the mistress approached, they offered polite but distant courtesy. When the wife appeared, they softened, warmed, leaned closer. None of this was dramatic. It was atmospheric. And the atmosphere was what the palace trusted most. The wife, maintaining her gentle composure, relied not on force, but on the clarity of her position. She did not send her maids to defend her. They defended her because they recognized stability in her presence. They aligned themselves with her because she represented order. And by aligning with her, they signaled to the court that she remained the center of gravity, the figure around whom balance coalesced. The mistress might shine brightly, but brightness was not the same as influence. Influence lived in repetition, in routine, in the daily reaffirmation of where loyalty belonged. This was how the palace learned to choose sides without a single word spoken. When the wife entered a chamber, the energy shifted gently but unmistakably. Conversations slowed. People repositioned. Servants moved with greater precision. The mistress, standing nearby, sensed the change but could not counter it. She had admirers, not infrastructure. The wife had infrastructure. She had rhythm. She had the weight of quiet routines that formed the backbone of the palace. No one ever saw the wife lift a hand against the mistress. She never made a demand or voiced a complaint. But the palace moved around her as though following an invisible current, one shaped by her stillness and carried out by those who understood how to interpret it. Her power did not depend on aggression. It depended on the willingness of others to protect what she represented. And in protecting her, they slowly closed ranks around her, leaving the mistress outside the circle without ever pushing her directly. Much of what tightened the court's loyalty had already grown from gestures too soft to name, shaped by the quiet coordination of those who watched her closely. Yet deeper shifts waited to settle, stirred by the palace's instinct to preserve its fragile order. Across the narrowing corridors of influence, another pressure was beginning to close in around the mistress's fading certainty. They never lifted a finger, yet the court reacted as if an unseen command had passed through the walls. That was the strange clarity of their method. The wife stayed where she always sat, her hands folded, her posture steady, her expression so mild it could almost be mistaken for indifference. People preferred to watch a storm, but they feared a still surface far more, because stillness made them imagine what might lie beneath it. And in the Tudor court, imagination was often deadlier than evidence. The wife understood this instinct better than anyone. She knew that blaming her would require proof, and proof was something she never provided. She did not accuse, confront, or advise. She offered only silence. And that silence became the space where others filled in the blanks. Every servant, every attendant, every official, drifting through corridors, sensed the shift before anyone named it. They whispered because they needed certainty. They speculated because the silence asked them to. And the wife let them, because that was the only tool she required. She did nothing publicly. No accusation. No plea. No performance of injury. Her restraint unsettled people more than an outburst ever could. If she had screamed, the court would have comforted her. If she had cried, the king might have assured her. But she offered nothing, and that left every person around her responsible for interpreting her calm. They projected their own fears onto her stillness and acted as if they were protecting her, though she had not asked for protection. The brilliance of her position was simple. Everyone chose her side without being invited. She understood the risk of overplaying her hand, so she never acted first. Instead, she created the conditions in which others acted for her. A slight shift in her expression made a maid reconsider whether the mistress had been disrespectful. A pause before answering a harmless question made a chamberlain rethink an earlier interaction with the king's favourite. A tiny hesitation, nothing more than a breath, held a moment too long. made an entire hallway of attendants sense that something had crossed a line. None of this came from her mouth. It came from what she allowed others to believe. And the court, hungry for direction, shaped the story quickly. The wife said nothing, but she seemed troubled. "It's not we should," she did not protest. But she did not seem at ease. "It's a founder's day," she did not blame anyone. But she did not seem surprised. I think smutching, these comments spiraled quietly, the way all-powerful rumors do. Not through volume, but through repetition. Servants adjusted their behavior. Advisors shifted their loyalties. Minor officials altered their routines so they would not be seen too close to the mistress. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of an unspoken tension. The wife understood that fear better than she understood love, and she used it with perfect restraint. The king, too, felt the pull of suspicion. He could not accuse his wife of scheming, because she never acted. He could not comfort the mistress, because to do so would expose him to the very rumors forming around her. He was trapped in a contradiction created by nothing more than the wife's lack of reaction. Her silence forced him to stand alone with his choices, and isolation made even a king unsteady. It was never the wife who ended a mistress's influence. It was the weight of collective opinion, wrapping itself around the king until he found the affair more exhausting than pleasurable. By the time he grew weary of defending someone nobody liked, the conclusion had already formed outside him. The mistress became less visible in invitations, less mentioned in conversations, and less welcome in rooms she once crossed confidently. Her presence became an inconvenience that no one wanted to address directly. The wife watched all this unfold with a stillness that bordered on mercy. She did not interfere. She did not encourage. She simply waited for the world around her to complete a task she never had to begin. And the beauty of her strategy was that no one could claim she had done anything at all. Silence protected her. Zulot. The collective murmur, shaped by everyone except her, did the rest. Much of what weakened the mistress had already gathered from voices eager to interpret what the wife never said, stirring judgment without a single command. Yet darker attention was drifting closer, drawn by the court's instinct to align itself with whatever seemed safest. Beyond that tightening hush, something else was prepared to turn even her absence into accusation. The king always heard things last, yet by the time anything reached him, it was already too heavy to ignore. He sat in rooms built to keep the world outside, but the world always found its way in. On the breath of courtiers, in the caution of attendants, in the overly polished phrases of men who feared displeasing him more than they feared lying. And when rumors finally reached his table, they never arrived as whispers. They arrived with concerns. A lord would clear his throat too gently before speaking. A counsellor would choose a phrase too carefully. A minister would frame a comment as if he were offering advice, not warning. The lady may no longer suit the needs of the court. Someone would murmur. The atmosphere has become unsettled. Then bows. No, there have been observations. It was not two. None of them dared accuse the mistress. None of them mentioned the wife. They spoke only of harmony, of the dignity of the court, of the fragile balance that might be tipping. Their words floated just above the line of disrespect, because anything lower would be treason, and anything higher would be defiance. The king listened, though he pretended not to. He absorbed every remark while maintaining the stillness of a man who wished not to understand the implications. He had chosen the mistress once, boldly, defiantly, perhaps foolishly. Passion made him believe he could neglect caution without consequence. Yet passion faded quickly in a palace built on duty. When officials began to hint that something was amiss, the king felt the tightening around him. It was not the wife's anger he feared. She had shown none. It was the court's disapproval. For disapproval had a way of making even a monarch feel suddenly mortal. As the murmurs multiplied, the mistress changed without realizing it. She tried harder to please him, which only made her seem desperate. She spoke more, which made her sound defensive. She placed herself in rooms where she had once been welcomed, but was now merely tolerated. Every effort to remain visible made her more conspicuous, and every display of confidence revealed the pressure she was under. She thought she was fighting for affection. She was, in truth, fighting against an atmosphere already shaped against her. The king noticed these shifts. He noticed the tremor in her voice, the practiced smile, the glances she cast toward courtiers who no longer hid their unease. None of this required accusation. None of it required the wife's involvement. The king watched the mistress sink under a weight she could not name. And in watching her, he felt something unfamiliar: exhaustion. It was easier to distance himself from her than to confront the machine of rumor grinding around him. A king could resist a rival nation, a rebellious noble, even a famine, but resisting the quiet, collective pressure of his own court was far more difficult. The court did not shout. It merely shifted its tone. And that tone made him reconsider choices he had once defended. When the final remark reached him, spoken by a counselor whose voice was smooth but heavy with implication, he did not react outwardly. "Your Majesty, perhaps it is time to restore order. The lady's presence may be less suitable now." "I see." Not a condemnation, not even an opinion. A suggestion disguised as an obligation. The kind of sentence that offered the king a way out without demanding he admit he needed one. And for all his authority, he accepted the offering. That night, he sat alone longer than usual, hands still on the armrests, gaze unfocused. The wife had said nothing. The mistress had said too much. The court had said everything without speaking plainly. He felt pushed, not by force, but by inevitability. By morning, the decision had already formed around him. With or without his consent, the mistress would be moved. Quietly, respectfully, as if for her own comfort. No punishment, no announcement, just a gentle redirection that everyone understood was permanent. And though the king never admitted it aloud, he knew he had not made the decision alone. The court had made it for him, shaping him the way it shaped everyone else, subtly, persistently, silently. Much of what cornered him had already gathered from voices too controlled to expose themselves, tightening his steps without laying blame. Yet the next wave waited to press further, drawn by the palace's instinct to complete what it had begun. Beyond the fading traces of her influence, another unraveling was prepared to expose what happened to those quietly removed. They were never dismissed with drama. No doors slammed. No accusations rang through the corridors. No public shaming decorated the palace walls. The women simply began to fade. It happened quietly, almost politely, as if erasure were a matter of courtesy. One morning, their names were still on the guest lists. Their gowns still awaited in cedar-lined chests. Their presence still considered a natural part of the king's daily breath. By next week, something had shifted. They found fewer invitations, fewer eyes turning toward them, fewer reasons to dress for the evening. Absence began as a whisper, but it worked like rot. No one addressed them directly. That was the first sign. A mistress accustomed to soft greetings from attendants would suddenly notice silence where acknowledgement once lived. A court lady would pass her without bowing, then apologize with a mumbled excuse about distraction. The apology was not real. The distraction was she had become invisible. And invisibility carried a warning no one dared articulate. The polite explanation always arrived in the same form: a steward, or a lady-in-waiting. Or sometimes, a distant cousin of the king would approach with a subdued expression and speak gently. "His Majesty believes some rest would do you good." One of the Massa Greece. "You have seemed unwell lately. The air in your family estate may help you recover." After, it was presented as a concern, but everyone understood what it really meant. She was being removed, sent away, not by command, but by implication. The palace preferred implications. They made cruelty appear compassionate. Most of these women obeyed without protest. What else could they do? To resist would be to admit fear. And fear was beneath the image they had worked so hard to maintain. They left in carriages that rolled softly over the cobblestones, as though sound itself wished not to betray them. They clutched blankets, letters, trinkets given by the king, tokens that felt heavier now than when they first received them. None of them knew whether they were leaving temporarily or forever. Almost all of them suspected the latter. Once they were gone, the palace adjusted with unsettling ease. Chambers that had carried their perfume were aired out. Servants folded away their linens and reassigned their attendants. Their names disappeared from lists of attendees, as though the ink had been diluted into nothing. When someone asked casually after one of them, the reply was always soft and brief. She is recovering. I tell Martgin, she is resting. Oh, also, she is unwell. Well, illness became the official story, though no one stated a diagnosis. The palace enjoyed illnesses without symptoms. They made removal seem natural. A woman could be sent away because she was fatigued, disturbed, or overwhelmed. All gentle words masking the truth that she had lost her usefulness. Meanwhile, the wives said nothing. They remained composed, eyes lowered, breath steady. Their power did not swell. It merely filled the space that had been cleared. They never celebrated the departures. They never smirked. They simply let the court interpret their stillness as authority. Silence, in their hands, was an instrument sharper than jealousy. For the mistresses in exile, time moved strangely. Days felt thick and slow, nights heavier. They waited for letters that never came, rehearsed explanations they would never give, and wondered whom the king favoured now. Some clung to the belief that they might be summoned back, but hope decayed quickly when faced with reality. No carriage came to retrieve them. No messenger rode from the palace. Their names no longer crossed anyone's lips. Back inside the royal halls, the memory of them thinned. New distractions emerged. New tensions took shape, and the machinery of court life continued without pause. What had once been scandal became inconvenience, and inconvenience quickly became irrelevance. To be forgotten here was as final as death, just quieter. By the end of the season, the palace no longer even pretended to remember them. Their absence had turned into a fact, an unspoken agreement. They were simply women who had not been well, women who had gone home, women whose time had naturally passed. This was how the Tudor court preferred its endings: bloodless, wordless, deniable. Most of what erased them had already settled into the quiet spaces no one bothered to question, leaving their absence heavier than their presence ever was. The court kept moving, unaware of how easily a life could be folded away once no one dared to speak it aloud. Near the hush that followed their disappearance, another truth waited to reveal who truly endured in a world ruled by silence. Noise was always plentiful in the Tudor court. Voices rising, fabrics rustling, footsteps crossing the stone floors with restless impatience. Yet it was never the loudest sound that mattered. What endured? What reshaped alliances and buried reputations? There was the low and steady quiet kept by the women who understood the cost of revealing too much. Mistresses, eager to defend themselves or to reclaim a fading warmth in the king's eyes, often spoke too quickly and too brightly. Their words became sharp edges in a place where every listener memorized. Distorted and repeated, the wives, seated behind their fans or turning their rings in silence, waited for the inevitable collapse brought on by overexposure. A mistress who felt threatened usually reacted first. She raised her voice. explained too many details, offered too many assurances, and tried too hard to remain essential. Each attempt to secure her place added weight to the growing suspicion around her. Servants heard her frustration. Courtiers heard her tremble. Even the king, lost in political matters. I noticed the shift from charm to desperation. In a court trained to read weakness as prophecy, her agitation became the beginning of her undoing. The wives understood this pattern with an almost chilling patience. They had long learned that anger was a trap, jealousy an invitation to mockery, and confrontation a gesture beneath their status. Their power did not come from the throne they shared, but from the quiet understanding that survival depended on restraint. Remaining silent allowed the court to project its own assumptions onto them, painting them as dignified, controlled, and steady, even when fatigue burned behind their eyes. Their silence created room for others to speak too much, room for rumors to attach themselves elsewhere, a room for the king to reconsider without anyone appearing to guide him. In this atmosphere, every spoken word was a liability. A mistress who tried to defend herself might inadvertently expose alliances she relied on. She might mention a gift not meant to be known, a conversation overheard by the wrong ear, or a moment of intimacy better left unspoken. Her attempts to protect her reputation became evidence against her. The court did not need proof, it only needed tone, urgency, or trembling hands. Her voice betrayed what silence could have concealed. Meanwhile, the wives let the court interpret their stillness. They sat at feasts without reacting when the king favored another woman. They walked through corridors with their eyes lowered just enough to appear indifferent, not wounded. Their composure told a story far more powerful than outrage, a story of someone who had seen mistresses rise and fall and understood that noise always burned itself out. Their silence became an unspoken warning, one that the court instinctively obeyed. Many mistresses failed to understand why their boldness backfired. They believed that being visible meant being safe. In truth, it meant being vulnerable from every side. Their laughter could be called arrogance, their confidence called manipulation, their concerns called hysteria. Any reaction, no matter how small, could be shaped into an accusation. The court needed no evidence to condemn a woman whom it already wanted to see removed. And so the wives waited. They waited through dinners where tension thickened the air. They waited through mornings when gossip crept like smoke under doors. They waited until the mistress stumbled. An unwise comment, an impatient sigh, a plea whispered too loudly. The collapse never looked dramatic from the outside. It began quietly, like a candle flickering before it dims. The court shifted its attention away from the mistress, and in that shift, her downfall became certain. By the time the king noticed the weight of whispers pressing on her name, she had already been isolated. The louder she protested, the deeper she sank. Her voice, once a weapon of charm, became the sound of her unraveling. Meanwhile, the wives remained untouched, their silence polished into something resembling dignity, strength, and inevitability. In the Tudor court, survival was not awarded to those who fought hardest, but to those who left nothing for others to weaponize. Silence became armor, stillness became strategy, and each woman who understood this played the long game in which the quietest breath could outlive the loudest cry. A hush settled after the last whisper softened, leaving only the evidence shaped from reactions that drew too much attention. The court shifted its gaze again, compelled by the contrast between those who spoke and those who endured. Around the quiet that followed, another truth waited to reveal how silence could become the sharpest force of all. Silence in the Tudor court was never empty. It had weight, temperature, and direction, moving like a slow current that carried the stories others were too eager to shape. A woman who chose not to speak allowed the court to fill in the gaps for her, and in a place defined by suspicion and performance, those gaps became powerful. The wives understood this far better than the mistresses, who tried to force narratives into existence. A silent woman left no edges for her enemies to grip. A silent woman became whatever the court needed her to be: calm, dignified, patient, daytown strategic. And once the court believed these things, they became true enough to shift alliances around her. Mistresses often failed to notice the power that silence created. They chased clarity, explanations, and validation, believing that truth could defend them. But truth had no value in the Tudor court unless carried by the right tongue, shaped by the right angle, whispered into the right ear. A wife who remained quiet placed her story into the mouths of others. And because people feared misreading her intentions, they spoke cautiously, respectfully. Silence made her unpredictable, and unpredictability demanded reverence. Every rumor born in that silence became a tool, not because she created it, but because she allowed it to exist. Rumors did not need confirmation to do damage. They needed only a target and enough space to grow. A mistress questioning her place fed the rumors. A wife who offered nothing in return strengthened them. It was a slow tightening of threads, one that required no visible effort. Servants whispered about the wife's composure. Courtiers admired her restraint. Even the king, overwhelmed by political burdens, preferred the stability of someone who did not ask for words. This dynamic turned silence into narrative control. The court began to imagine her thoughts, her motives, her hidden wisdom. They projected caution onto her stillness and authority onto her quiet gestures. The wife needed only to keep her expression steady during feasts. Let her gaze lower for the briefest second, or pause before answering a polite greeting. These tiny acts, barely movements at all, were interpreted as depth. Her silence became a map others followed, even though she had never drawn it. For mistresses, the situation was more precarious. They had to speak to be seen. They had to defend themselves because no one else would. Their noise became part of their identity. And once the court labelled them as disruptive, the label clung like dust to silk. They were blamed for the tension at dinners, for the king's distraction, for the faint discomfort that travelled through the palace corridors. Even when they tried to speak gently, their words sounded like scratches on polished stone. In contrast, the wife's silence was perceived as smooth, refined, and controlled. The more stories people invented about the wife, the fewer stories remained available for the mistress to shape. Silence was not passive, it was a form of editing. A wife could erase entire chapters of court drama simply by refusing to contribute. She could redirect attention without lifting a finger. She could tighten or loosen political pressure merely by choosing where to stand during a ceremony or which expression to wear beneath her veil. Eventually, people began telling her story for her. She must know something. In I-5, she must have a plan. Nights 1, she must see further than the rest of us. It's been I counted. Silence transformed speculation into truth. And at just the right moment, when the court had exhausted itself guessing her intentions, that was when she allowed the smallest gesture. A faint smile, a softened eyelid, a hand resting calmly on the table. It was enough to confirm every rumour without committing to any of them. The court believed she had just revealed something meaningful, though she had revealed nothing at all. In a world where every whispered accusation could destroy a life, silence became an art more lethal than confrontation. Mistresses fell because they insisted on speaking. Wives endured because they understood the value of holding the story rather than telling it. And in the Tudor court, the one who held the story controlled the outcome. A stillness settled after the last unspoken thought shaped itself into the room, guiding interpretations no words could have achieved. The court adjusted its understanding again, convinced that meaning lived in the quiet rather than the noise. Beside that deepening silence, another shift, prepared to reveal who truly commanded the story without ever raising a voice. Rumour was the quiet blade the Tudor wives never needed to hold. It lived in the spaces they left untouched, the pauses they allowed to stretch, the glances they released without urgency. A mistress could fight an accusation, argue against a whisper, or plead for the king's attention, but she could not fight the shape that silence gave to the court's imagination. The wives understood that survival in this world did not require force, only endurance. They outlasted the storms that others created. They outlasted the performances, the flirtations, the fragile bursts of triumph won through charm instead of stability. And eventually, they outlasted the women who entered the palace with bright eyes and left with their names fading behind them. The court rarely witnessed the moment a mistress realized she was disappearing. It did not happen with a shout or confrontation. It arrived like a slow winter morning, where the frost thickened without anyone noticing the night before. Servants stopped bowing as deeply. Courtiers forgot to include her in conversations. The king's gaze slid past her, as if momentarily distracted by affairs of the state. Even the air around her seemed to shift, making every move feel heavier than the one before. The wives did not need to intervene. The court had already decided what story to believe. Longevity itself became a form of authority. A wife who stood quietly in ceremonies, who maintained a steady presence beside the throne, reminded everyone that her power did not depend on affection or novelty. It depended on time. Time spent watching others rise. Time spent watching others fall. Time spent learning exactly how rumors travel through the corridors. Living longer in the king's orbit meant accumulating a weight no mistress could replicate. It was not love that protected her. It was permanence. Mistresses burned brightly, but brightness made them fragile. They glowed too close to the edge of court politics, too close to the scrutiny of nobles who resented sudden influence, too close to the hopes and ambitions of families seeking favour. The wives, however, stayed near the centre, steady, familiar, unmovable. Their silence allowed the court to imagine that they were harmless, until it became clear that harmlessness itself was a shield sharper than accusation. A mistress who entered the palace believed she could shape her own destiny. A wife who had endured long enough knew that destiny shaped itself around the quietest person in the room. When the mistress began to feel the pressure of rumours carving into her reputation, she reacted. Her reactions fed the whispers. Her fear made her vulnerable. The wives remained still, and stillness became the ground the court trusted most. There was no moment when the wives needed to strike. They did not speak against the women who threatened their position. They did not protest, accuse, or warn. They simply lived long enough to see the stories turn in their favour. A quiet woman in a dangerous place becomes a mirror that reflects the fears of others. The court filled that mirror with whatever narrative suited its needs: dignity, wisdom, and duress. Whether it was true never mattered. The mistresses, on the other hand, became canvases for suspicion. They accepted gifts too eagerly. They spoke too openly. They reacted too visibly. Every gesture became evidence, twisted and adapted by voices eager to justify their downfall. And when the court finally tired of the drama surrounding them, the decline unfolded without force. They were escorted away under the guise of illness or rest. Their rooms were reassigned. Their jewelry was removed. Their names gradually slipped from conversation until speaking them felt unnecessary. The wives understood that this outcome had nothing to do with vengeance. It was maintenance. The court needed stability more than it needed beauty. It needed tradition more than it needed passion. And so the wives survived, not because they fought, but because they waited for the world to correct itself in their favour. In the end, rumour did what steel never could. It isolated a mistress without anyone lifting a hand. It replaced influence with doubt. It made the court feel righteous in its cruelty, convinced that silence equaled virtue and noise equaled guilt. The wives walked through these outcomes with practiced calm. offering no satisfaction, no triumph, no visible pleasure. They did not need to celebrate. Endurance was celebration enough. A mistress might believe she was undone by misfortune, by betrayal, or by fate. But the truth was simpler and darker. She was undone by the story others told about her, while the wives let their own stories be written for them through quiet observation. In a world shaped by whispers, the one who refused to speak controlled the script. The court eventually forgot each mistress, as though she had never existed. Her absence became easier to explain than her presence had ever been. Meanwhile, the wives stood at the edges of ceremonies, their hands folded neatly, their expressions unreadable, their silence preserved like polished stone. They did not destroy their rivals. They simply survived until the world carried those rivals away. And in the dim halls of the palace, where footsteps echoed more loudly than truth, that was enough to win. A heavy calm settled after every unspoken decision, holding the weight of stories shaped by silence rather than intent. The court drifted into acceptance once more, certain that endurance marked the line between those who faded and those who remained. Beside the last quiet breath of this tale, the night waited to gather every whisper into rest. Thank you for staying with this story until its final breath. May your night be gentle, your thoughts unburdened, and your sleep deep enough to carry you far from every whisper that lingers in waking hours. Good night.